Hey y'all, this is Shon Gerber. Thank you so much for listening today. But before we get started, I have a question for you. Would you like to finally pass the CISSP and get started building a lucrative and rewarding career in cybersecurity? I can help you over at CISSP cybertraining.com with the resources and tools you need to pass the CISSP the first time. At CISSP cybertraining.com, there's a vast array of resources available that will give you the guidance, direction, and training you need to pass the CISSP exam. As soon as you get done with this presentation, head on over to CISSP cybertraining.com so that I can begin helping you today to meet your CISSP goals and grow your career in cybersecurity. All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Reduce Cyber Risk and CISSP Training Podcast, where we provide you the training and tools you need to pass the CISSP exam the first time. Hi, my name is Shon Gerber, and I'm your host for this action-packed, informative podcast. Join me each week as I provide the information you need to pass the CISSP exam and grow your cybersecurity knowledge. All right, let's get started. Giddy up. Hey, y'all, it's Shon Gerber again with Reduce Cyber Risk, and today we are going to be talking about Domain 5. This is RCR 52 Access Control Types, Domain 5.1. And as we're talking about various aspects today, we're going to be getting into access controls and how are those important with your CISSP. And so this is kind of the next step, Domain 5. We talked about Domain 4 last week, and some of the exam questions that you will see are around this coming week will be around Domain 5. And this is our ongoing effort to teach you how to pass the CISSP the first time, right? That's what it's all. The ultimate goal is that you pass the CISSP and move on with your security career. Okay, so as we're going to start this off, we're going to get into InfoSec Institute had some aspects around access control types. And so you'll be able to see these links in the show notes, and just kind of wanted to go and give a plug out to them. But the first thing we're going to talk about is administrative access controls. Now, these are laid out by top management of an organization. So these administrative access controls are set up through the organization, and they'll say what they want to have people to have access to. Now, you as a security person may have to help them lay these out or put these in place and put these together. And so therefore, these administrative controls are very, very important when you're trying to limit access to an environment. Now, some of the control components focus on a couple areas. You have procedures and policy. Now, every organization should have its own security policy to which all the employees must adhere to. I deal with this on a daily basis. They really have to adhere to it. Now, depending on your organization, you may have a lot of policies, you may not. You may have just a few. But it is a high-level plan that kind of sets out how management plans to have people utilize this equipment or the aspects of their environment. The policy can include actions that are deemed acceptable and the level of risk the company is willing to undertake or accept. So those are key pieces. So as you're building your security policy out, the company may decide that they are going to accept some level of risk, or they may not. They may have in there the penalty in the event of a breach that, say, for instance, a situation occurs where a breach happens. Well, who are they going to let know? How is that going to affect their company? And these policies are normally compiled by a quote-unquote expert, a security person, and they would work potentially with compliance and legal on this. And I don't say potentially, I'd highly recommend it. So if you're building procedures and policies for your organization, definitely work with your compliance and legal folks around that. Now, typically, you have your policies and procedure piece. You also have your supervisory structure, which all organizations will have some level of organizational structure around this, and you need to define what that looks like. And again, depending upon your knowledge around this, a supervisor is typically someone is placed above an employee from a supervisory standpoint to help them work. And so therefore, that you may want to call out how is that spelled out within your procedures and your policies. The supervisor will approve all administrative control additions. If you have to have admin access to an environment, the supervisor will approve it. And then also the supervisor could be the person that approves it for everybody, or it could go to security as well. So you're going to have to define your policies, and then how does management get involved in this management of change piece. Another one is personnel controls. So these personnel controls describe the expectations of an organization towards its employees. Okay, so what are the employees going to do? What is management expecting of the employees? And it's also used, these personal controls, for addressing non-compliance with meeting to these expectations, right? So those are all aspects that are in place. Again, you can change the status around these access controls. They can be, is someone hired? Are they suspended? Are they terminated? Are they promoted? Usually not promoted, depending on the access control, right? But if someone is terminated, what happens to their access? Is removed. If they're suspended, what happens to their access? If they move to a new role within a different company, if you have a multinational or multi-company that's got a large bunch of companies involved in it, or a different organization within your company, what happens to the access controls? Separation of duties as well. And these are aspects that you want to make sure that you import into your environment, that you have a separation of duties that are in place. So for an example, if someone wants to transfer money to another company, they have to have supervisor approval. They can't just do that on their own. That would be a separation of duties. And I highly recommend that you do put that level of control within your organization if you do not already have it. Another aspect is duty rotation. So you may be in a situation where employees are in the one job for quite a period of time. You may want to rotate them out of that job into a new job, to one that has a different position. This is a way that you can find out if they've been doing things they shouldn't be doing. 2, it gives them an opportunity to expand their capabilities, but especially when you're dealing with roles that may have significant risk, where they have access to a lot of different aspects, you may consider putting that in place. So just kind of food for thought on that point. Another benefit of this is that it does, if they do plan on committing fraud within their position, the chances of getting detected is really much more significant. And you want to do this so that they really don't know it's coming. You want to basically say once every quarter, and in a period of time within that quarter, quarter's probably not good, but every 6 months to a year, you move them to a different role. Again, that's a pretty broad thing to do, and it's pretty large, but it's something to consider. Some other examples of administrative controls are information classification, personnel procedures, investigations, testing, security awareness and training. Those are some different administrative controls that you can put in place around individuals. Now, the second aspect is a technical access control. Now, technical controls are typically like a logical control. They're tools and or software that can be used to enforce restrictions. So those are controls that you put in place. It could be a specific tool you have to log into. Like if you got a remote access, you utilize a Citrix product or another remote access capability. Some of the most important technical access control components are network access. So these network access controls defines the mechanisms that authorize access into network resources like switches, routers, bridges, etc. That is your network access. That's what allows you into the environment. There's system access, which is data sensitivity, right? So if you're going to allow them access into a certain system, you may utilize username, passwords, biometrics, smart card. All of those aspects could be utilized for system access. There's also auditing. In such cases, you want to go back and you want to audit that network. I highly recommend that you build an auditing plan within your environment that goes back, and especially on these high-risk systems, and reevaluates whether or not the adequate controls are in place. Encryption and other protocols, you need to make sure that you have those in place for your networks, whether it's going on through the network itself, the encryption of the tunneling, or if it's encryption on the device itself as well. But you need to make sure that you do utilize encryption in your environment. When we talked about architecture in the last Reduce Cyber Risk podcast, the physical and logical layout of your network, is it properly architected in a way that adds a level of security, or is it architected in a way that just causes confusion and pandemonium? That depends. So you want to make sure that you have that properly protected and properly put in place. Some technical access control tools worth mentioning are ACLs, IDSs, antivirus software, and as well, your dial-up callback systems. All of those things need to be in place from a technical control standpoint. Now, when you're dealing with physical access controls, there is network segregation. Again, you want to make sure, we talked about that in previous episodes, where you want to segregate your networks in a proper format. This could be through VLANs, it could be through just firewalls, but you want to make sure that it is adequately separated, and where that not everybody has full access to everything. It's just really important to do. You also need to look at security of the perimeter. Depending on the organization, the perimeter security needs to be carried out to ensure that there's no unwarranted people getting into your environment. There's no way to make it into the premises. Some other physical access control components could be computer control, separation of work areas, backup of data. All of those are physical aspects that could be put in place to limit the access control. So an example around that would be fences, badges, security guards, TV, alarms, backups, all those things. Now you're carrying out different access controls. There's things to consider around that. You implement system-wide, and this should be integrated into your operating procedures that you have at your locations, and these access controls should be defined and written out. Typical access control process would be identification of the subject, authentication, privilege ACLs, which is your access control list, and then audits. So these are steps that need to be performed as well to do that. And so therefore you put these in place, and it's a way that you can set up some level of authentication within your environment. Now this can be done by matching credentials. This is how authentication can work, is through matching of credentials found and that are within a database. So if you're dealing with CISSP, you know that you have to have some level of authentication when it comes to your database. And this is how those things can be done. These credentials aren't found in the database. Obviously, then you can't be gained access to that database. You cannot be granted access from an authentication standpoint. Now, privilege ACLs, they offer authentication, the system checks that nurture privileges that are to be granted. A subject will not be allowed to perform actions on an object that they don't hold the privilege to perform. And so again, these are pieces that you need to consider as you're dealing with privileged ACLs. And then audits. You need to perform periodic audits that need to be performed in order to ensure that there aren't any security vulnerabilities. I highly recommend some level of auditing to occur within your environment. It's just really, really important to do. All right, so that's basically around the synopsis that was with the access control types from InfoSecInstitute.com. Again, you can check out what they've got there. Now let's roll into the CISSP training, and let's get going. Okay, speaking of the CISSP training, we're going to talk about domain 5.1, which is access control types. Now, there's the thing that we start with all of this, let's kind of begin with a little bit of an overview, is that controlling access is instrumental in controlling what you do as it relates to access control. I said controlling 3 times there. No, it's basically you want to control your access as much as possible. And again, that's the name, access control types. And many of these aspects do work together when you're controlling the various aspects around it. So when you're talking hardware, software, policies, all of these work interchangeably to control the access that you want to accomplish. And as these assets can be information, systems, devices, facilities, all of these aspects are considered an asset. So that's one thing that you want to consider when you're dealing with access. Now, some key aspects around this is it does include all of the data. So no matter where your storage of your data is at, it includes everything. It could be storage on your PC, it could be storage in Amazon S3 buckets, it could be pretty much anywhere. So you want to make sure that you understand where your data is at. And I was in a meeting not too long ago, and we were talking about protecting of data and SharePoint migration. And as you're moving data from one location to the next, one of the things that came up, and it was kind of an epiphany for an individual in the room, was it's really about all about the data. And it truly is. It's really always all about the data. So you need to consider these different storage locations, and it does. It goes from thumb drives to S3 buckets, is all need to be incorporated into what you're doing. Now, access controls, you also are designed to attempt to restrict unauthorized access. That is the goal of access controls, is to keep people out that don't belong. Now, there's different processes that are involved with access control. First thing you need to do is you need to identify the individuals or users that need this access. So if you've got a individual who needs specific access to a SharePoint site or needs access to a folder, you need to identify them. It may not be you, but it may be not the instructor. It may be the supervisor that may have to define who that person, what kind of access that person needs. You also need to determine if this access is authorized. So just because a person may need access doesn't necessarily mean that they should have access. So that would have to be determined as well. You need to grant this access based on identity. So depending on the identity of the individual, that access would also need to be would have to be granted based on their identity. You also need to monitor and record access. So then as they go in, you're watching what they do, you're also going to record it, and you're going to annotate where it would go, or who's having access to it, why they have access to it, and then you're logging that information for future reference. Now, there's some various access control types. Now, you've got a preventative, you have detective, physical, compensating, corrective, administrative, deterrent, logical, technical. Okay, so those are the big ones that you deal with when it comes to access control types, and we're going to get into each individual one. So when you're dealing with the preventative access control types, these are designed to prevent unauthorized access. So you're preventing somebody from getting in. It could be as simple as, do you have a gate, physical access, way to prevent them from getting in? Do you have, there's a computer system has got a specific logon for you, your username and password, that would be designed to prevent unauthorized access. The next one is detective, designed to detect unauthorized access. So do you have a means to determine if someone is trying to gain access that shouldn't have it? So this could be CCTV cameras, could be security guards, could be your security incident event management system. All of these aspects could be in place to prevent or to detect if someone's trying to gain access that shouldn't have it. Another one is physical. So on physical, this controls that require physical contact. This could be fences, security guards, badges. All of that would be a physical restriction. Now, it could be as simple as when you get to the keyboard, maybe you have a biometrics involved on the keyboard. That would be another physical way. So those are different access controls. Your preventative, detective, physical. Now we get into compensating. These are alternate controls when the original is not available. So, for example, when you have a new account startup, and you notice that when you do that, if you go to a website and they want a new account that's getting stood up, you have to enter in a temporary password, and that temporary password will gain you access. But then you're going to have to make changes to your account to have continued ongoing access. Well, that is something that is a compensating control type that would keep you from gaining access to something in the short term, but it's not the original one that you want to keep for a long term. There's corrective. Now, this allows for modifications when unauthorized activity has occurred. As an example would be you deploy an EDR solution, which is your basically endpoint detection and response solution that would happen for a breach. So you've had a breach occur, we got to stop the arterial bleeding, we got to know what's going on. You would potentially deploy an EDR solution for that breach. Administrative. Now, these are policies and procedures deployed by an organization that would be designed specifically for controlling access to information. Background checks, classification, data classification, all of those pieces would be considered administrative. Deterrent is designed to discourage violations of a security policy. This would be security badges, security training, you name it. Along those lines, you're designing to teach people that it's a bad idea to do it. And one of the things that I talk about when we are working with individuals that we're going to be doing logging and monitoring on, one of the aspects around actually logging information of people of people gaining access to sensitive data is the fact that you want people to know that you're doing it. And by saying that, what happens is then people will understand that you're watching. So it's kind of like the statement of Jedi mind trick, right? You want them to be able to know that you're watching, because hopefully that will be somewhat of a deterrent to discourage violations against what you're trying to accomplish. And then you have logical and technical. These are technical controls to limit or restrict access. This is your username, password, firewalls, etc. So those are some of the big different access control types that are available. Preventative, detective, physical, compensating, corrective, administrative, deterrent, and logical/technical. Now, when you're dealing with authentication factors, these are things that you deal with: passwords, tokens, voice, fingerprints, and so forth. And there's key pieces. There's just 4 key basics for you to keep in mind when you're understanding authentication factors. It's something you know, which would be a password, right? Your username, password. Something you have, which is a token or a smart card. So it's something that you actually are carrying on your body, your presence. It could be your thumbprint. Those work sometimes as something you have, but it's more like not necessarily a thumbprint. It's more like your phone itself. Something you do, putting your phone prints or a voice, eyeballs, facial recognition, and then something you are, which would be biometrics, your eyeball, those kind of things. So something you know, something you have, something you do, something you are. So no, have, do, are. It sounds like a really bad movie. So those are the things around authentication factors. Now, logical and technical access controls. So we talked about passwords up above. The passwords are something you know, and it's typically a string of characters. And I'm going to as I talk to this to you all are going, yeah, duh, I know this. This is not hard. But these are just some key things you need to consider when it comes to the CISSP test you need to be aware of. So logical and technical access controls. These are, a password is something you know. It's a string of characters and is typically associated with a username. It's the weakest security mechanism out there. They were designed in the initial things to have something to restrict people. So when computers first came out, they wanted some way to have a control around who could gain access to these computer systems. So what did they do? They used a username and a password. Well, in the 70s, yeah, that's fine. It worked out okay. But now that everything's interconnected, it's actually a terrible mechanism to control access. It's one of the weakest ones you can have because people use the same one because there's just so many of them. Again, we talk about why passwords are so bad is because they're reused, they're shared, they're easy guessable, and they're transmitted in emails, texts, etc. And I noticed that was an interesting time when I was talking with a friend of mine who is a bank manager at a bank that we are connected with. And this bank manager at the time asked him, where do you store all your passwords? And he paused for a second, and he goes, and he made this look on his face. It's like, well, I store them in a really secure place. And I said, well, where's that? And he says, in my email inbox. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's not good. So we had a long talk and we got that worked out. But needless to say, that's where passwords are typically stored. They're stored in all kinds of goofy locations. So when you're creating a strong password, you need to have complexity, special characters. They need to be at least 12 characters. They need to be changed frequently, and they need to change each day. That would be ideal if they could. If they could change each day, that'd be awesome. But there's products out there that can help you with that, but realistically, that's what would be the best. Password phrases, they should be long passwords. They should be sentences. They basically should have different generators or personal accounts that will create these long passwords. If you can do them in a passphrase where you have something such as culture, wings, barely, tool, griffin, nascent. Okay, so I wouldn't have any idea what that means, but that's a couple using words together to create a very long, nasty password. Now, you may want to add some special characters to that just to make it a little bit harder, but bottom line is you want to use words to create a long sentence or a long structure to help you add some level of depth to your password. Now, smart cards and tokens. A smart card is kind of about the size of a credit card. You'll see that military uses these a lot, but they basically have an integrated circuit chip built into them. And there's certificates based on who they are located on this chip. So when you deal with logging in or send an email, what they'll do is they'll use this chip, they'll use this smart card to authenticate who they specifically are with their certificates. So you're going to have a combination of username, password, PIN to utilize the certificate. However, it's another way of, it's something you have with you. That's another thing to use as a smart card. Now, tokens, these are password generating devices. These are usually 6 to 8 digit generated devices, and they're typically used like a little fob. And you'll put those in, and they will generate this random number, and those are used to help authenticate to a device, to a website, whatever it might be. But these are typically a token. Now, the tokens, the physical devices are actually going away. A lot of these are rolling into smartphones, which have that capability. Google Authenticator is another good example around that actually has that software capability built into or that you can download and put on your phone. So they're really pretty cool. It's a 6 to 8 digit generation device, and it's usually there's a synchronization aspect to it that basically connects to a clock, and that clock will then generate a new random key, and those keys are all tied together so that when you have a certain window, you type in those digits that to whatever website you have. When you type in those digits and hit return, it then contacts that Google Authenticator to see if those are the actual digits at that time, and if that's the case, because they've been synced up, then it allows you access. Now, there's asynchronous, which is algorithm based, and it's based on how, and again, smart people with lots of big math have figured out how that all works, but it's basically the difference to consider is synchronous is an authentication piece with a clock, asynchronous is algorithm based. Now, as you're getting into biometrics, it basically comes down to something you are. It's not infallible. There's people that you can get around. I've noticed recently that there was a way to get around the Windows, or I should say the face recognition of the iPhone 10, but bottom line is it's still a very good mechanism. Your thumbprints, actually, it's harder to do your face, obviously, because there's so many contours, but your fingerprint can be spoofed. There are some things to consider around that. Now, some examples of that would be fingerprints, your face, your retina, heart patterns, voice recognition. All of those fall into the biometrics space. Okay, so that was the training for the CISSP based on the ISC² training manual and the study aspects you need to pass the CISSP the first time. All right, so let's go roll into some CISSP questions. Now, this comes from Tech Target. And this is some questions that they have that have come out there. And so let's go ahead and roll right into those. All right, so abstract episodes of interaction between a system and its environment. Okay, so these are abstract episodes. So basically, what are these episodes of interaction between a system and its environment? Misuse cases. Web proxies. So misuse cases is A. Web proxies is B. C is use cases. D is negative testing. So misuse cases is A, web proxies is B, use cases is C, and negative testing is D. And the answer is C, use cases. So if I honestly, in the military, I didn't really understand this until I got into corporate America, but realistically, that term is used all the time in corporate America, but it's basically abstract episodes of interaction between a system and its environment. Things that happen, it's a use case. Some use occurred, and then that's a case that how it turned out the way it did. I struggled with some of the words that they used in corporate America compared to what happened in the military. So that was probably one of the biggest aspects I had to work through. But a use case, that's what it is. A list of the most widespread and critical errors that can lead to serious vulnerabilities in software. A. Information security continuous monitoring. B. CWE SANS top 25 most dangerous software errors. C. Automated vulnerability scanners. D. Real user monitoring. Okay, so the list of the most widespread and critical errors that can lead to serious vulnerabilities in software. A. Information Security Continuous Monitoring, ISCM. B. CWE SANS top 25 most dangerous software errors, which, okay, that would be very subjective. C's. Automated vulnerability scanners. Well, that's not really a list of most critical errors. It's that way that works, right? It's a scanner that does the work for you. Or D. Real user monitoring. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the correct answer is A. Information Security Continuous Monitoring. All right, question 3. This criteria requires sufficient test cases for each program statement to be executed at least once. However, it is achievement insufficient to provide confidence in software products behavior. Okay, that's a lot of big words that really kind of run together that don't make a whole lot of sense. So let's read it one more time. Now, this comes from Tech Target. Sorry, I should have put the plug out there for Tech Target. But this criteria requires sufficient test cases for each program statement to be executed at least once. This criteria provides sufficient test cases for each program statement to be executed at least once. However, its achievement is insufficient to provide confidence in the software product's behavior. Okay, so it's basically trying to do test cases, and then after it occurs, it says it's insufficient to provide confidence that the software's products is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. A. Statement coverage. B. Data flow coverage. C. Condition coverage. D. Path coverage. Okay, so that one's you have to work through. If you don't know this one, then you're going to have to narrow down some things. Data flow coverage, that wouldn't make sense, right? Because it's a criteria. And basically it's not talking about flow, all right? D, path coverage, I would probably struggle on that one to think that's probably not it. So I would think if it's some sort of statement or condition. So you got A is statement coverage, C is condition coverage. Well, and the answer is statement coverage. That is the answer. So basically, you'd have to kind of work your way through that as it comes to the CISSP questions. All right, so that's all I've got for today. I hope you have a wonderful week this coming week. And you know what? It's great here in the wonderful state of Kansas, so it'll be great next week as well. I know it will be. Thanks so much for joining me today on my podcast. If you like what you heard, please leave a review on iTunes, as I would greatly appreciate your feedback. Also, check out my videos that are on YouTube. Just head to my channel, CISSP Cyber Training, and you will find a plethora of content to help you pass the CISSP exam the first time. Lastly, head to CISSPcybertraining.com and look for the free stuff that is only available to our email subscribers. Thanks again for listening. See you.